Welcome to today's online learning event, the F Word, Tackling Performance Feedback. We're very excited to be able to present this event, and thank you all for attending. A few housekeeping items to mention. Audio for our webcast is streamed over the internet and available through the speakers on your PC. If you are in an open office, we recommend you use headphones. Before we begin, please note that there is a question tab in your control pane on your screen. Please send your questions throughout the presentation. We will be doing a question and answer session at the end of the session, and we will do our best to address as many questions as possible. Today's session and the PowerPoint slides will be posted on HR.com's archives within 48 hours. Please feel free to share this archive with coworkers and friends. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our sponsor, CRG-M-Perform. M-Perform provides all-inclusive web-based talent management software, including a new tool for capturing and sharing feedback called TAG. If you want to learn more about M-Perform, we will provide contact details at the end of the presentation. Let me introduce myself. I will be the moderator today. My name is John Smith, and I am the Director of Enterprise Business Solutions at CRG-M-Perform. Just a quick overview of the format of this presentation. During the webinar, we will have a panel of experts provide insight into the importance of ongoing performance feedback, challenges that HR managers and employees face getting, giving, and using feedback, how continuous feedback is shaking up traditional performance reviews, and creating a feedback-centric culture. Again, we invite you to submit your questions to our expert panel throughout the discussion, and we'll do our best to get to all of them at the end. Let's meet our expert panel. We're very excited to have the following people participate in today's webinar. First, let me introduce Marnie Green. Marnie leads the consulting firm Management Education Group that specializes in preparing leaders to confidently manage employee performance. She authored a book called Painless Performance Evaluations, a practical approach to managing day-to-day employee performance. This book is a practical tip-based guide for managers who prepare and deliver performance evaluations. Marnie is currently finishing up a follow-up book, Painless Performance Conversations, which focuses on the essential skills of delivering performance feedback. Also, Marnie and M-Perform have partnered on several occasions to deliver some great webinars, and many of them are available for download on the employee-performance.com website. Our next panelist is Elizabeth LeCavalier. Elizabeth is the Vice President of Human Resources at Forensic Technology based in Montreal. She is an active member of CRHA. Elizabeth brings over 20 years of experience in the service and high-tech industries, working with companies renowned for their best practices in human resource management. Elizabeth is a forward-thinking professional who has some unique takes on traditional performance management. She's spoken at several conferences and was recently interviewed by Canadian HR Reporter. Our third panelist is William Tincup. William is one of the country's leading thinkers on social media applications for human resources. He's an expert on the adoption of HR technology and one heck of a marketing professional. William's been blogging about HR-related issues since 2007. He's a contributor to Fistful of Talent, HR Tech Europe, and HR Examiner. He also co-hosts a daily HR podcast, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, Drive Through HR. I would like to extend a big thank you to all three of you for joining us today. We certainly look forward to getting your take on this very hot topic. Let's just dive right in. The format of the panel discussion is going to be simple. We're going to raise a topic for discussion and go around the table and get your input. We are going to start things off by asking why performance feedback is so important. But before we get to the answers and get to the panel, we're going to launch a quick poll. And what we want to know here is, which best describes your overall approach to employee feedback? So we encourage all of the participants to go ahead and give us an answer. Is it avoided at all costs? It's structured or a semi-annual event? Ongoing feedback is key, or Answer D, no approach. We've never thought about it. Let's take a second and gather some results here. We're going to show them to you right away, and once we do that, we're going to go to our panel to talk about the poll and the question, why performance feedback is so important. So we've got some results coming in here, and look at that. Overwhelming majority telling us that ongoing feedback is key. Okay, so why is performance feedback so important? We're going to start here with Marnie, and then we're going to ask Elizabeth for her take, and then William. Marnie, can you give us your take on this?
Sure. Thanks, John. And I think the poll gives us a clear indication that the majority of the folks on the line understand that this is a key component of how we operate our businesses. And yet, I think sometimes it's a challenging prospect. You know, in fact, I think it's getting a lot of buzz these days because it's a basic human need. It's what we crave, and we all want to know whether we're on track and how valuable we are, and that we are adding value to our operations, and we all want to be successful. However that's defined. But you know, even employees who act like they don't really have an interest in feedback, I find, can you all hear me? I'm getting a little bit of feedback.
Yeah, you're good, Marnie. You're good, Marnie.
Okay, good. So, so that even those employees who act like they aren't interested in feedback, or where feedback hasn't been valued, it's still something that they crave. A number of years back, I managed a work group of employees who had been with the organization for a really long time. And in fact, my most challenging employee was a guy named Bob, and he'd been with the organization longer than I'd been alive at the time, and that is not an exaggeration. And when I became the manager of the group, Bob indicated to me in a lot of different ways that he was not interested in feedback. I would drop by his office to talk about his performance and his goals. He would push back from the desk and kind of sigh loudly and say, you know, it's all fine, I'll let you know if I need you. And I would kind of slink away thinking that he wasn't interested in feedback. And a few weeks later, I'd do the whole drill again, and I'd get the same response. And this went on for months, him really not wanting to engage in conversations about feedback. I think he'd been there so long that he had gotten used to training his managers to basically leave him alone. He was an adequate performer, and so nobody really had pushed him and engaged him. And I'd been teaching feedback techniques for quite a while when I inherited Bob, so I knew that it was important to keep it up. And so I would stop by his office regularly with a question or a tidbit about his work. Sometimes it was praise, sometimes it was something constructive, but always with the intent to indicate his value to the organization. But to be honest, he challenged me, and there were times when I thought, I don't even want to give this guy feedback anymore, I just want to leave him alone. But what was amazing was after about 9 months of this dance, there was a shift. And in fact, one day he didn't rebuff me. Instead, he did sigh. He wasn't enthusiastic. But when I asked him about his performance goals, he pulled out a file folder that had his name on it. And he said, you know, I had an issue with one of my clients this week, and I wasn't really sure how to handle it. He kind of rolled his eyes, and he said, I knew you'd be around eventually. So I wrote it down. I wrote down the issue. We had a productive conversation about the challenge that he was having. It was really kind of a turning point because from then on, Bob and I had a productive working relationship. We were never friends, but we were certainly professionally productive. And you know, at his retirement, which was many years later, he acknowledged that I was a supervisor that paid attention. The initial question was, why is feedback such a hot topic? Why is this important? And I think my experience with Bob illustrates that you know, we all do want it. It's a human need. We crave it, and when we get it, we perform at higher levels. And even if we don't actively seek it or even seem to rebuff it, it's something that in organizations, if we want high-performing organizations, we can't ignore.
Thanks, Marnie. That's great. And an interesting little story there to go along with it. Thank you. Elizabeth, can we ask for your feedback on this one?
Sure, of course. I really think that performance and the feedback that that goes with it, is really all about getting results and making businesses successful. I think that sometimes what we overlook is the important link between feedback and great performance and the impact on business results. So I see feedback as a process to get results. So from a business person's perspective, it's an avenue to pursue with our workforce to get the type of results that we need to be successful. There's been tons of research on the topic of engagement, employee engagement, done by the Corporate Executive Board in Washington, D.C. And one of the things they point out, they make linkages which are so interesting and so compelling. So when I'm talking to our executives at work, I dig up their research, and it's so longitudinal and fact-based that you really can't say it's wrong. But they make a very, very strong link between giving employees feedback on their performance, the performance level itself, and then business results. And engagement wraps all the way around that. Now, that sounds very easy. The problem is that we tend to think about feedback just in one context, and that's that dreaded event, the end of the year annual performance evaluation, and that's a real trap. That's a real trap, and I think that employees, as Marnie said just now, they crave feedback, whether it's on a personal level or a group level. We all want to know how we're doing. I mean, I do too, let's be honest. And we want to know that in real time. So it's not really just about gratification at a personal level, rather that most employees, I think, they want to know if they have to make course corrections, in what direction, and how to do that. So in my mind, feedback becomes critical to my employees growing on the job, developing their skills, and me actually retaining them. So that makes a strong business case. But you need timely and substantive performance feedback for that. One last point I would make is that, not to be overlooked, is that feedback for our high potentials is just critical to our organization. I think feedback is important for everybody, but we always pay special attention to our high potentials. And we've adopted in my company an interesting practice. Our general manager, he's my boss, our GM and I, we sit down with our high potentials every year, and we get them to give us feedback. Feedback on how they believe their development is progressing, how they believe the business is doing, and so forth. It's a very, very interesting conversation, but the important thing here is that they're given the opportunity to give us feedback. It's kind of like a reverse feedback mechanism that certainly helps the business. So I see the need for feedback as really a driving force that really benefits both employees and business results.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And I got a big buzz there out of the link to business results. That's great. William, over to you on this one.
Sure. I think Marnie, for me, kind of hit it on the head when she said that we have a human need, and in some ways, we need to bring humanity back to the office. With everything being digital, email, text messages, all the social media, everything, in a lot of ways we become lazy when it comes to conversations with people. Fierce conversations, brutal conversations, even just thoughtful conversations. We become lazy in some ways because of digital. Well, I sent that email to you. Well, that's not quite the same as sitting down, looking someone in the eyes, and kind of connecting with them. So in some ways, our lives have become easier, but we've become kind of divorced from sitting across the table and giving someone feedback. And we all need, as Marnie and Elizabeth have both said, we all need some form of interaction with other humans. Feedback, in my opinion, can be a nice way to connect with coworkers. I think the difficulty that we all kind of face is when you say the word feedback, it automatically denotes, or it automatically conjures up something negative. And I think in some ways we got to rebrand feedback or reposition it in our firms that feedback's not a dirty word. Feedback's not a bad word. And in fact, feedback should be anticipated and appreciated and loved. And so I think our biggest hurdle in some ways on our organizations, however we deploy it towards whatever ends, we've got to kind of bring people back into the fold of loving the word feedback or the concept of feedback.
That's awesome, William. Thank you. And so a recap quick on this one. Marnie's bringing up the basic employee and human need and that people crave feedback. Elizabeth talked about that, talked about the link to business results, and of course William's telling us to bring humanity back to the office and that feedback is not a dirty word. There's some great thoughts on this topic so far. So let's head over to our next question here. We called this webinar the F word because feedback is oftentimes feared and avoided like it's a bad word. Why do you think that is? What are some of the challenges that you've seen with HR, managers, and employees getting, giving, using, and managing feedback? I think this time we're going to start with Elizabeth, go to William, and then Marnie. So Elizabeth, do you want to take a crack at that?
I sure will. It's probably the most interesting questions that, from my perspective, that you've put to us, because I'd answer it back with a question, I think. Why is it so hard to achieve what should be so simple? Feedback is, after all, really a conversation. And William just mentioned this concept of fierce conversations. You know, I think I might agree with that. I think that, you know, feedback often requires managers to be courageous and to leave their comfort zone. And that could be a first block, if you like, to giving effective feedback. But I've always kind of thought that this term, fierce conversations, is an oxymoron or a contradiction in terms, if you like, because it implies that these conversations are all difficult and challenging and might even be called intimidating. But in my mind, it's not always the case. And while I recognize that there can be some challenges that even myself might face at some point in my career, here are some that I found that I've both observed and experienced as an HR professional. Managers have to be courageous, but it's sometimes difficult for managers when they want to be liked by their employees. And when you're delivering corrective performance feedback, for example, you might well be disliked. But I see this as being part of the role of a manager. A manager sometimes has to disengage. In our company, for example, we have a very, let's just say, friendly culture, and it's challenging sometimes for managers to separate themselves from their employees and remember that they are the boss after all, and they do have that responsibility. You can't be friends with everybody, you know, and especially your own employees. And I'd like to give a personal example. In our organization, one of our managers actually resigned, and in my mind I thought we'd all failed in recruiting probably the wrong person and then not taking action to end that employment relationship soon enough. So I decided to give this feedback to the hiring manager. She's one of our high potentials, and it was tough for her to hear that, to say to her, you, I, and the rest of the company have failed, is not a particularly nice thing to say, but it needed to be said, and just to set the record straight so we don't make the same mistake all over again. I don't think I was particularly liked for saying that, and the manager actually left my office mumbling something that began with an F, and let me tell you, it didn't stand for feedback. But again, you know, sometimes the feedback is tough, but it must be said, and you know, you can't shirk from that. You know, I work in a high-tech company, and it's easy for our managers to say, oh, they're very busy right now, they're writing code, they have to support the employees, so they're doing some of the technical work. That's easier for them to say than to be courageous and give feedback. So it's not necessarily a natural reflex. It takes time, requires some planning. And you have to be serious about it and understand that it's not just helping your employee, but also you as a manager to grow, be successful, and ultimately, you know, there are the business results again, ultimately helping the company achieve the results it needs to have. But what I find another barrier to the feedback is that it builds up to this major event called the performance evaluation or performance assessment. And there seems to be so much build-up that it becomes very dramatic, not to say traumatic, for both parties, manager and the employee. Sometimes we see this materialize into heated exchanges, or the opposite end of that would be a kind of non-event where the employee feels that they didn't really get any feedback. And this, I find, it satisfies no one and really defeats the purpose of good feedback. So,
thank you, Elizabeth. That's really interesting. I want to move this over to William to keep this on pace. So, William, what's your take on this? We've heard from Elizabeth that managers can't be friends with everybody, and we've also heard that a lot about the courageous conversations that well, it's not just about courageous conversations and tough conversations. There's also good conversations and happy conversations. Do you have a take on this?
I do, absolutely. I think in some ways you have to diagnose what exactly are you delivering and why. And so I built a very simple framework for feedback. If everyone were to just draw a 2x2 on a piece of paper, you'd understand that on one axis you have positive and negative, and on the other axis you have solicited versus unsolicited. The worst type of feedback in some ways is when someone doesn't ask you for it and you give them negative feedback. There's just not a lot of fun in that conversation, no matter how you sex it up. On the other end of that is when something's positive and someone asks for it. That's chocolate. That's good stuff right there. The thing is you have to know, ultimately, are they asking for my feedback? Are they soliciting my feedback? Okay, well, if not, totally understand that. Am I giving them feedback necessarily? Am I giving them feedback that's positive? Is it in a way going to help them, et cetera, or is this negative? What I've come to learn is people, until they're really ready to kind of hear that negative feedback, the critique, you almost have to get them ready. You have to prime the pump in some way. So I think the first step, what I would say, John, is you have to know what am I delivering? What am I delivering and why am I delivering? So I think that once you know that, once you've kind of mapped that out and you know what kind of content that you're going to be putting in front of people, I think two other things really quickly. One is training. We need more training in order to deliver content feedback. Great feedback, we need more training, and we also need to train the people that are receiving the feedback. So I think that there is an element of training in our organizations that we just assume that people will pop out of the womb, go through high school, go to college, and then they can accept feedback. And I don't think that that's true. I think we actually need to do ourselves a better service of training ourselves and delivering, training those in receiving. And the last thing I'd say is there's nothing more frustrating than giving inactionable feedback. Meaning, I think that this is the burden on the person that's creating the feedback to say, is that actionable? Am I asking? Am I just kind of describing a problem? Am I throwing a rock at a glass house? Or am I giving this person actionable feedback? And I think that's where it gets back to the feedback being a dirty word, is when we just give people, we describe the problem. Hey, you're coming into work late. It's got to stop. Bam. But we're not digging into it. It's like, okay, well, let's talk a little bit about different flexible work schedules, because obviously you're not getting here on time. You probably have good reasons for that. Let's dig into that, etc. So there's no action behind it. And I think if we did a better job, John, in terms of just creating actionable feedback, people would probably take it.
Thank you, William. Clearly important training and action-oriented feedback. Marnie, over to you on this. What's your take on this subject?
Yeah, I think William's hit the mark with the idea that we need to prepare people to give and to get feedback. And one of the concepts that really resonates for me about what that training might include comes from a book called You Already Know How to Be Great by Alan Fine. Alan Fine talks about the concept of interference, and that's one of the challenges of giving and getting feedback. I really like this idea. He says that interference can be external, noise in the room or in the environment, but mostly what gets in our way is the internal noise. It's the fear, the stories we tell ourselves in our own minds, and they prevent us from delivering feedback that's clear, that can be clearly understood or even clearly heard. And so interference are those stories we tell ourselves about why the person's behaving the way they're doing, or why they're arriving late, or why they're making these errors. And that internal dialogue about our own capabilities sometimes too. Interference about, we tell ourselves, oh my gosh, don't screw this up, or you better say it this way, or you better be ready if the employee shouts or cries or whatever. And then we tend to exaggerate what we're afraid of. It's that 800-pound gorilla in our head that I think is the biggest challenge. And so when you think about training, I think it's really important that we help managers and feedback receivers have the right frame of mind about feedback, and that it is a productive process. Because when we end up paying more attention to what's going on in our heads than the actual performance and our role in helping them improve, then we're not paying attention to the right thing. So I think that's the biggest challenge.
That's great, Marnie. Thank you. So we started off hearing from Elizabeth that, she asked a question, why is it so hard to achieve what is so simple? And, she told us a little bit about her thoughts on this, and that these feedback cannot, it's not always about being courageous, and also that managers, can't be friends with everyone. William talked about the importance of training for feedback, and also that it needs to be action-oriented. And Marnie, I think you rightly pointed out that, people giving feedback have to get beyond their own internal interference, we'll call it. So that's, those are some great takes on this question. Let's move along to the next question here. And the next question is, how is ongoing feedback shaking up the traditional performance review? And again here, before we start this discussion and go to our panel, we're going to launch a quick poll. So on your screen, you should see a poll that comes up saying, how often is your organization conducting performance appraisals? And we'd like to hear from you on, is it once a year, twice a year, every 3 months, monthly, or never? So let's give these folks a chance to come in and put their results in, and we'll share those in a few seconds. And we're getting close here, and I can see the answers coming in on my side because I've got it up on the screen in front of me, and I can tell you it doesn't surprise me. And are we going to go ahead and publish this? And here we are. Look at that, far and away. We're conducting performance appraisal once a year. So how is ongoing feedback going to shake up the traditional performance review? And on this one, I think we're going to start with William, go to Marnie, and then Elizabeth. So William, do you want to take the lead on this?
You bet, you bet. I think frequency, when you look at the word or the concept of frequency, I think it has to be aligned with the values of the firm. If the company prides itself on speed, the ability to pivot, etc., then constant feedback is essential to the business objectives. So in some ways you have to mirror the values of the firm into what type of system of feedback and or appraisals that you want to kind of set up. But I would also say that frequency can be disruptive, meaning let's say I ask a coworker, this idea of constant feedback and all of it being a positive thing. But let's say I ask a coworker to change something significant, like I've noticed that their writing styles, that they don't have a good command of grammar, etc. And I want them to change that. That's something that's very important to the business, very important to me, it's very important to them, it's going to help them in their career path, etc. Something significant. You don't just change your writing style and become a great writer over 2 weeks. But then I grade them again in 2 weeks, i.e. I give them more feedback in 2 weeks later. So the idea that frequent communication, conversations, feedback, etc. It also has to be mirrored not just to the values of the firm, but also to be mirrored to what action am I asking them to change. And so something that's significant, you need to have a little bit longer tail to understand that they're not going to be able to change that overnight. I haven't given them, in some ways, I haven't given them the time or resources to be successful. And I think that's where great feedback systems really work and frequent systems really work, is when you give people the time and resources to actually make the change that you'd like to see.
Interesting, interesting. Okay, thank you, William. Marnie, over to you on this one. Marnie, are you there with us? I don't hear Marnie, so Elizabeth, you know what? I'm wondering if you can chime in on this. Oh, you're there, Marnie. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry
go ahead,
about
Marnie,
that.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah,
No problem at all.
The idea of continuous feedback, I really think that drive for more frequent feedback that that employees seem to be craving is leading to organizations to rethink their traditional standard elements of performance reviews. Like, do we even need a rating scale? Is that a productive process for us? Do we need to have numbers if we're going to rate performance? What I'm seeing is organizations moving towards providing competency models that define the expectations for performance that are very behavioral, cascading goals that link to strategic plans so that employees understand how their day-to-day contributions link to something bigger, and then building in more frequent, as William said, formal conversations about progress. I actually yesterday was working with an organization that's completely gotten rid of any rating at all, any judgment in terms of numbers or calculations or a scale. And their process is just content about the employee's performance with the intent to help improve performance. So what's not changing in all of this is the need for some kind of documentation, that there has to be something that supports employment-related decisions and something that shows that the conversations have happened. So even if we get rid of some of those traditional elements, I think there still is a need to have some record about these conversations. But the key shift really is to focus now on the need to develop performance conversation skills as opposed to those traditional skills of truly evaluating and making judgments about performance.
Okay, thank you, Marnie. And Elizabeth, your take on this. And I know you've got one here, Elizabeth, because you've shaken up your traditional performance review. So I'm looking forward to hearing your comments here.
Yeah, well, yes, we are in the process of shaking. I don't think we're shaked yet totally, but it's a long process. We used to be on the page of the traditional, well, definitely once a year, if not maybe twice a year at best. And we're moving towards a model of more continuous feedback as an ongoing discussion. And one thing I'd just like to say here on the topic of feedback is that, we're talking a lot about managers here. I really believe that employees have a serious role to play here too. They need to solicit feedback too. They need to ask that question, how am I doing? What do you think? How could I improve? Having said that, I agree with William that we do need to have the time and the resources, and yes, training is definitely necessary. But I think that sometimes we can make this into too structured a process. You need some sort of framework for feedback and to evaluate performance. But I find that when you adopt a traditional approach to this, and you focus on ratings and bell curves and did you complete your performance feedback yet, and HR turn into a sort of police force here. I don't think that we're really hitting the key objectives that we want to get there. So in my wildest dreams, I kind of think that, well, one day we won't have any performance evaluation. We'll just have this ongoing discussion, no more forms, no more fixed meetings to discuss a yearly review, no more angst, I think, rather a discussion between adults. And I think that sounds so simple, but frankly, we've still got a bit of a way to go. One other thing I'd just like to squeeze in here, John, and that is I think that when we talk about feedback in the context of performance, over and above training and processes and maybe forms or systems that we have at our disposal, we've built a series of tools that create occasions for more feedback. So it's not a full set of occasions, but really when somebody has performed well, we have an online peer-to-peer feedback and recognition program, so employees can talk to one another about their take on their performance. We have spot bonuses that give us an occasion to reward and recognize great contribution. And then we have a formal process too, again, more feedback on employees, discussions on employees' career plans, career opportunities. So I think that, we need to build these opportunities into the way we work.
Very good, Elizabeth. So we can see here a bit that technology is helping us a bit with capturing this continuous feedback dialogue. And Marnie, you mentioned, a bit of trying to bring in more frequent feedback, but still kind of a conversation around a traditional appraisal form with competencies and goal management and action-oriented items. William's certainly pointing out that, we need to align the frequency of this performance appraisal with the values of the organization and the need the need for changing things, the need for actions changing, action-oriented change, and he keeps bringing up that action-oriented word, which is really good. And of course, Elizabeth, you're kind of right in the trenches of doing this, and so I like this occasions for feedback, and we start to see a link there between performance review and reward and recognition, and what a great concept that is. Let's move along to our next question, and this is actually our last question we're going to ask the panel today. How can the audience create a feedback-centric culture in their organization? And we are going to go to a poll here on this one as well. So in a second, the audience is going to see a poll launch, and we'd like to get the audience to give us some feedback themselves on this question. And the question here is, how would you grade your organization on training managers to give feedback? And your choices are A+, B, C, and F. So this is a really interesting one. Let's see what comes out here. Okay, we're going to give this a few seconds, and then we'll share the results with everyone. Okay, and I think we're going to share the results here, and the results come up, look at that, 50% in the C area. This will be interesting to go to the panel to get their feedback on this. There is 2% of the audience, guys, saying A+. Look at where this dispersion is in the B. In the B category, at B and A, we got 26%. In the C and F category, 74%. So I'm wondering if this is going to surprise anybody here when we go to this one. And I think on this last question, we're going to start with Marnie and go to Elizabeth and then William. So Marnie, over to you.
Sure. Those are interesting results, and I would love to talk with the folks who are in that A category to find out what you're doing, because it is such a challenge, and I think a lot of organizations are not investing wisely in the training that they're providing as it relates to performance management. I really loved what Elizabeth said about creating occasions for feedback. And the first tip that I had for implementing these ideas is to spend more time developing the conversation skills of managers, and I think it has to be within a specific context. So rather than just teaching feedback skills, let's teach managers some very practical, actionable techniques that they can use in specific kinds of feedback conversations, like the spot awards, like corrective feedback, rather than just training them on process forms, calculations, those kinds of things. And John, you mentioned that technology seems to be aiding this, and I agree. I think when you leverage technology, it frees managers up then to focus more on the content of what they need to share with the employee rather than on fulfilling some process expectations. So the training and leveraging technology, those would be two ideas. Another would be to really focus on your top leaders so that they can eventually model the behaviors that you're looking to reinforce, and provide coaching and support to those executives so that they can have productive performance conversations as well. The final suggestion, and this is another resource that I've been leveraging with folks, and it seems to be a real climate shifter. Marshall Goldsmith, one of really our leading executive coaches these days, has an exercise that he does frequently with groups called Feed Forward. And he's really redefined the concept of feedback, and he says that feedback is about the past. What can we do about the past? It's done. But what if we had more conversations about what we're going to be doing and seek input before we even do it? So what I've adapted that to work with groups that on a regular basis, employees and team members are encouraged to bring their challenges to the table, whether it's a staff meeting or whether it's just within the cubes, and ask each other for input before they actually take action on whatever their project is. So the idea is that we're asking for input before it's too late. And I really like that approach because I think it's much more hopeful, it's much more forward-focused, but it also it means that we're preparing people to be successful rather than trying to fix them after they've failed. So those are some ideas that I would offer, and I'm interested in what everybody else has to say.
That's great. Thank you, Marnie. Elizabeth, can we hear from you on this?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that Marnie and I are probably thinking on the same level here, because a couple of my notes, I really do believe that if you don't have role models at the top, the senior leadership team, then you'll never create a culture, you know, with those enshrined behaviors and practices that flows down through the organization. So it has to start at the top. I certainly agree with you there, Marnie. And I guess in my company we're fortunate because we have a very people-oriented president and general manager, our COO, and he's made solid feedback and expectation for all of our managers here. Now, that doesn't necessarily make it flow down naturally, so we've done something that's kind of interesting, and some of our listeners might consider this. You know, there's the traditional training you can give on communication and coaching and giving feedback, but last year we did something rather experiential with our managers. We, from around our offices around the world, we gave them training on emotional intelligence. And I have to tell you, not many people would have wanted to sign up for this if I'd made it optional, but we made it a management development initiative. And the result of that gave our managers great insight into the relationship with their employees and the impact that they can have on them. And what our managers took away from that is something my wildest dream, that I'd never have expected this to really happen. But it harks back a little bit, Marnie, to what you're talking about. They created, remember we're a high-tech company, they call themselves the Manager User Group. So, but their nickname is the MUGs, Manager User Group, with an S on the end. So the MUGs meet every few weeks. It's a manager-only meeting. I'm not allowed to attend. And they take problem cases to the meeting. They're discussing with their peers. Many of these cases have to do with performance feedback or performance problems, and they discuss them with their peers, their fellow managers, consult with them, and then they're peer coached on how to provide the appropriate feedback to their employees. And I find this is really empowerment, and it's extremely important in instilling this culture of continuous feedback. And what's really great about this initiative is that people hear about this, that, you know, the MUGs, sort of the acronym does the rounds of our organization, and the next level down, we call them team leads, heard about this. They also had training, the same training on emotional intelligence, and now they formed the TUGS group, the team lead user group. So I think it's a great example of appropriate behaviors coming right from the top down through the company.
Oh, that's excellent. That is excellent, Elizabeth. MUGs and TUGs. That's great. William, let's go over to you on this one.
Yeah, I think feedback should be different depending on the status of the individual, and what I would like in a perfect world is highly personalized feedback, meaning I understand and know how one really appreciates feedback, and then I can deliver upon that. I think that top performers result in basically 80% of the business objectives, so I would, in a perfect world, I would start there. I would love to kind of hit everybody, but I would start with the top performers, as it's been mentioned by both Marty and Elizabeth. If you're going to give feedback to one of your top performers, you miss with them, and it actually impacts the business. You miss with one of your bottom performers, a tree that falls over in the forest no one cares about. So you've got to get it right when you're dealing with the top performers. Ask them how they, if you don't know, that's okay. On some level, I think it should be the goal to find out how they like feedback. So again, getting back to the conversant part of feedback, it's just like, hey, listen, we're going to do this whole feedback thing. I want you to give me feedback. I'd like to give you some feedback. How would you like that? how's this best? Would you like to go get coffee? Would you like to carve out some time? You want to schedule some time? You want to do it over the water cooler? Like what's going to create an environment in which you want to receive feedback? And what you might find is someone that tells you exactly, you know what, I got to do it early because once I get into my day, my head's a miss, and I'm not really going to hear you. I mean, I'm going to hear you, but I'm not going to hear you. So if we could do it before 8 a.m., that'd be fantastic. Oh, okay. Well, something like that, I'd like to know, etc. When you're doing performance reviews and or feedback with bottom performers, I think whatever you have to do to document, you do. But I mean, ultimately, I'd like to know how they'd like feedback too, but it's not going to impact the business. I mean, hopefully it'll get them back on the right path, but it's not going to really shake up your business outcomes like it will with a top performer. I don't believe in cookie cutter feedback. I don't believe in the approach that, like, if Marnie and Elizabeth and I were giving feedback to John, or we would all have different approaches. And there is an approach that works with John. So I think on some level, from the company's perspective or the manager's perspective, we just need to do a better job of finding out what is that petri dish that will create the perfect environment in which John will take that feedback. And the last thing, we don't have all the time in the world, but I would focus on the people that have the biggest impact on the business. And I really want to know how they want feedback and then deliver feedback to them, positive, negative, constructive, whatever, however you want to cut it. But I want to know the frequency in which they want it. I want to know how they want it delivered. If they're kind of a brutal honesty kind of a group of people, I want to know everything I can about them so that when I deliver feedback, it is then appreciated, respected, and then actioned.
Very good. Thank you, William. So we heard from Marnie that, creating a feedback-centric culture involves asking for input before it's too late, and that continuous feedback should be considered forward-thinking. And in the forward-thinking world, Elizabeth told us about emotional intelligence training and how her firm has instituted the MUGS and TUGS group, the manager user group and the team user group. And Williams just talked a little bit here about focusing feedback to start with on the big impact players in the organization and talking about asking them how they want their feedback delivered. And I think that's some really practical guidance on how to start the process of creating that feedback-centric culture. So what we're going to do, I think, at this point is move over to questions. And we have had a number of questions come in through the session. It's been an excellent discussion so far on many facets of feedback. And the Q&A session is ready to get started here. And I'm gonna start taking a look through some of these questions. And the first one we have out here is, what are your opinions? I guess this is to the panel, so we're going to hear from each of you guys on this. What are your opinions on giving employees feedback to rate their managers or supervisors? Should feedback only be top-down? So how do you, let's hear from the panel on top-down and bottom-up and the blend, one or the other. Let's maybe, to keep things in order, we'll start with Marnie, Elizabeth, and go to William on this one. So Marnie, your thoughts there?
My first gut reaction is from that very traditional performance evaluation approach, and so my answer is no, we don't want the employees to be assigning ratings to managers. But when we start redefining what we mean by performance feedback and managing performance through feedback, it makes all the sense in the world. So if your system is still very numerical and you're providing ratings and you're filling out those kinds of forms, then those traditional forms, then I'm not real comfortable with that, because I find that it becomes a tool that works against you. People game their ratings to send messages or whatever. But if you have, it's really just about feedback and how can the manager better serve the employee and better meet the employee's needs so that the employee can provide the highest levels of contributions to the organization, then that makes perfect sense. And I think part of our culture shifting and our training very much needs to be about helping managers ask for that kind of input and engaging employees in those conversations about how they can better be served so that managers can continue to improve as well. So that's my reaction.
Thank you, Marnie. So Elizabeth, over to you. Should employees be able to rate their managers?
Yes, absolutely. In my company, they have many mechanisms to do that. When we come towards the end of a performance year, we use a 360 feedback mechanism. So that feedback goes straight, it skips a level up, going to the manager of the manager, so that gets played right back. We also do skip level downs. So my boss, for example, might meet with my employees and say, you know, is there anything you want to discuss? How's Elizabeth doing? And so on and so forth. And the last mechanism we use, because we really think it's important to hear from our employees, through our employee engagement surveys, there's typically a whole section on how my manager is doing. So employees can give feedback through that route as well. I think it's very, very important. It shouldn't just be one way down. I really believe it should be going back up as well.
Interesting. Okay, William, what do you think about the bottom-up feedback process?
Well, ultimately, not to be a cop-out, but I think it comes down to the values of the organization. And if you are an organization where you value feedback, then you should value it 360. Period, end of story. It shouldn't be one direction or another. I think something else to solve for is what type of generations you have at work. I do believe that different generations kind of contend with and interact with and maybe even perceive feedback differently. And last thing, when you're dealing with some people that are a little bit more social savvy, they're going to give you feedback anyhow. They just might do it through Facebook or Twitter or a blog or other mechanisms. So you may as well create an outlet. In that instance, you might as well create an outlet to garner that feedback and maybe learn something about your organization and or help you become a better company. So I think I hate to say it depends, but it depends.
Thank you, William. Okay, interesting. Elizabeth, there's a question from the audience that's directed to you. So the question is this one's for Elizabeth. Any suggestions for getting buy-in from the top for encouraging a solid feedback process?
Yeah. I would use the approach of looking first to research. And let me explain why I mean that. I work in a high-tech company. People are extremely well-educated here, PhDs, masters, and so on and so forth. Very, very experienced people. So they have an opinion about everything. So when I want to put something new or different on the table at the executive level and then have it go all the way down through the organization, I always use fact-based research from a very credible source. I mentioned earlier how we're a member of the Corporate Executive Board in Washington, D.C. Their research on a number of issues is just infallible. And has been adopted in best practices by some of the leading organizations in North America and around the world. So that's generally my my approach, because you know, you have to know your audience, I should say, first. And when I know my audience, I know that this is an approach that works with them, because they find that they can't really argue about facts. You know, it's human resources stuff is soft stuff. It's not a science. High-tech science. It's all about science and concrete things. So when you approach an executive team on a soft subject, it's very good to have facts behind it.
Very good. Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth. I think we've got time for one more question here, and this one is directed at William. William, why do you think employees are so reluctant to ask for feedback?
Well, reluctant right now is because of job security. No one wants to make a ripple. Everyone, those that are privileged enough to have a job want to keep their job, etc. And asking for feedback is really a kind of a game of vulnerability. It's standing in front of the mirror naked and acknowledging your weaknesses and your vulnerabilities. And it doesn't have to be that way. But because we've kind of misdiagnosed and mispresented feedback, employees are a little shell-shocked. And I think that a great culture, a work culture, if you will, is one where even in a recession, people can ask for feedback. So I think that the reluctance is probably tied to the times. But I think that there are great examples of companies out there that, they won't fire you if you ask for feedback. And or if you get negative feedback like, hey, here's some things to work on. It doesn't mean it's a pathway to termination. And so at some level, we have to prove that to employees. We need to prove that this performance appraisals and all this muckety-muck around feedback is not just a way to document their problems, and it's not just a way to document to then terminate. We need to use that as a way of saying, hey, listen, we went through several feedback sessions and we've seen a progression of you getting better and you're getting better, and thankfully this is awesome. Like, it doesn't have to lead to something negative. So I think the reason that people don't ask for feedback right now is probably commonsensical. It's probably just due to the high unemployment rates.
Okay, thank you, William. And that seems to be all the time we have for questions. First, want to thank our three panelists for their great insight. Certainly, feedback is a hot topic today. It's important that organizations become better at it, and also that they manage it. And we can see, I think, from what we've learned today, that HR has a big role to play in leading this change. And again, thank you to the three panelists. Just excellent contributions today. If you'd like to connect with Perform or the experts after the webinar, please email us at info@employee-performance.com, and we'll be happy to get any questions answered that haven't been answered yet, or to provide a link or a contact information. You will be receiving a survey after this event, so please take a moment to provide your feedback on today's presentation. Thanks again to everyone for joining us, and we'll look forward to speaking with you all again. Thank you.